On a gray November morning in 1991, in the small borough of Homestead, Pennsylvania, a young woman named Christy Mirack prepared for another day teaching fourth grade at Rowerstown Elementary School. She was 25 years old, beloved by her students, known for her patience and her bright smile. By mid-morning, when she failed to arrive at school, concern rippled through the staff room. By afternoon, when police broke down the door of her garden apartment, they discovered a scene that would haunt investigators for nearly 3 decades. Christy lay on her bedroom floor, her life stolen in an act of unimaginable violence. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. No witnesses came forward. The killer seemed to vanish like smoke, leaving behind only questions and a community gripped by fear. Who could have done this? And how could someone commit such a crime and simply disappear into the fabric of ordinary life? The borough of Homestead sits along the Monongahela River, about 7 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, in Allegheny County. In 1991, it was a town still bearing the scars of industrial decline, the steel mills that once defined its skyline now mostly silent. The neighborhoods were tight-knit, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where children played outside until the streetlights came on, where doors were often left unlocked. It was a community built on trust, on the belief that terrible things happened elsewhere, in bigger cities, to people you didn't know. Christy Mirack had grown up not far from Homestead, in the nearby community of East Lampeter Township in Lancaster County. She was the youngest of 3 children, raised in a modest home by parents who valued education and hard work. Her father worked in manufacturing, her mother as a homemaker. Christy had always loved children, always wanted to teach. She attended Millersville University, earning her degree in elementary education, graduating with honors in 1988. Friends from college remembered her laugh, the way she could light up a room, her genuine kindness that never felt forced or performative. By the fall of 1991, Christy had been teaching at Rowerstown Elementary for 3 years. She lived alone in a small apartment on Dairy Road in East Lampeter Township, a quiet residential area with mature trees and well-kept lawns. The apartment was on the ground floor of a modest 2-story building. She had decorated it simply but warmly, with plants on the windowsills and children's artwork taped to her refrigerator. Her parents lived just a few miles away. She spoke to her mother nearly every day. November 25, 1991, was a Monday. The weather had turned cold over the weekend, temperatures dropping into the 30s. The sky, a flat, colorless gray that promised winter. Christy had spent Sunday evening at her parents' house for dinner, as she often did. Her mother would later remember that Christy seemed happy, talking about her students, about the upcoming holidays, about plans to visit relatives for Thanksgiving. She left around 8 o'clock that evening, hugging her mother goodbye at the door. That night, Christy followed her usual routine. She prepared her lesson plans for the week ahead. She graded some papers. She likely watched television for a while before bed. Her apartment was quiet. The building had other tenants, but the walls were thick and people kept to themselves. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that the hours ahead would end in tragedy. Monday morning, November 25th. Christy's alarm likely went off around 6 o'clock, as it did every weekday. She needed to be at school by 7:30. The drive from her apartment to Rowerstown Elementary took about 15 minutes in light traffic. She was meticulous about time, never late, the kind of teacher who arrived early to prepare her classroom, to greet students as they came in. Those who knew her said she treated teaching like a calling, not just a job. Somewhere between 6 and 7 o'clock that morning, someone entered Christy Mirack's apartment. There were no signs of forced entry. The door showed no damage. The locks were intact. Whoever came in either had a key or was someone Christy knew, someone she trusted enough to open the door to in the early morning hours. Or perhaps the door had been unlocked. Perhaps she was in the shower or getting dressed and didn't hear the knock. What happened next was brutal and swift. The attack occurred in her bedroom. Christy fought. There were defensive wounds on her hands, scratches and bruises that told investigators she had tried to protect herself. But she was overpowered. The killer strangled her, pressing down with such force that blood vessels burst in her eyes and face. The medical examiner would later determine that she had also been struck in the head, though whether before or after the strangulation remained unclear. The attack included a sexual component, though investigators would guard those specific details closely, sharing them only with a small circle of detectives. Clear's throat by 7:45 that Monday morning, when Christy had not arrived at Rowerstown Elementary, the school secretary called her apartment. No answer. The principal tried again at 8 o'clock. Still no answer. This was unlike Christy. In 3 years of teaching, she had never simply failed to show up. If she was sick, she called. If there was an emergency, she called. The silence was wrong. The school contacted Christy's parents. Her mother felt her stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Her father immediately drove to Christy's apartment, arriving around 9 o'clock. His daughter's car was in the parking lot, a red Mazda 323 that she had bought used the year before. He knocked on the door, no answer. He knocked harder, calling her name. Nothing. The curtains were drawn. He couldn't see inside. He found the building manager and explained the situation. Together, they opened the door. What they found would change everything. Christy was lying on her bedroom floor, clearly deceased. Her father stumbled backward, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The building manager called 911. East Lampeter Township police arrived within minutes, followed shortly by Lancaster County detectives. The scene was secured. Yellow tape went up. Neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk, whispering, trying to understand what was happening. By noon, news vans were parked along Derry Road. By evening, Christy Mirack's name was on every local news broadcast. The investigation began immediately. Detectives from the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office took the lead, working alongside East Lampeter Township Police. The crime scene team spent hours in Christy's apartment, photographing everything, collecting evidence, dusting for fingerprints. They found no signs of forced entry. They found no obvious signs of robbery. Christy's purse was in the living room, her wallet inside with cash and credit cards untouched. Her television, stereo, and other valuables were still there. The medical examiner arrived to examine the body before it was removed. Time of death was estimated between 6 and 8 o'clock that morning, based on body temperature and rigor mortis. The autopsy would be conducted the following day. Evidence collection was meticulous. Swabs were taken, fibers were collected, hair samples were preserved. In 1991, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy, but investigators knew to collect biological evidence carefully, understanding that future advances might make it valuable. The neighborhood canvass began that afternoon. Detectives went door to door along Derry Road and the surrounding streets, speaking with anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual that morning. Most people had been inside, getting ready for work, getting children ready for school. It was a Monday morning, routine and ordinary. One neighbor reported hearing what might have been a scream around 6:30, but it had been brief, and she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Another neighbor had seen an unfamiliar car in the parking lot early that morning, possibly around 7 o'clock, but couldn't describe it beyond saying it was a dark sedan. Clear's throat, those who knew him said the investigation quickly became intensive and far-reaching. Detectives compiled lists of everyone in Christy's life, family members, friends, colleagues at the school, former boyfriends, acquaintances from college, anyone who might have had access to her apartment. They interviewed Christy's parents multiple times, piecing together her final days, searching for anything unusual, any person who didn't belong, any conflict or threat. Christy's mother told investigators that her daughter had mentioned feeling uneasy a few weeks earlier, like someone had been watching her. She hadn't been specific, hadn't mentioned any particular person or incident. It was more of a feeling, the kind of thing that's easy to dismiss until it's too late. Had someone been stalking her? Had someone been waiting for the right moment? The search operation expanded throughout the week. Police searched nearby wooded areas, drainage ditches and dumpsters, looking for anything the killer might have discarded. They were searching for weapons, for clothing, for any physical evidence that might have been thrown away. They found nothing. Whoever did this had been careful or lucky or both. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Vigils were held at Rowerstown Elementary, where students and parents gathered to remember Christy, placing flowers and stuffed animals by the school entrance. Her fourth-grade classroom remained empty for weeks, the desks still arranged as she had left them, her handwriting still on the chalkboard. Volunteers organized search parties, though it was unclear what they were searching for. The killer had already fled. The crime scene had already been processed. But people needed to do something, needed to feel like they were helping. Media coverage was intense. Local newspapers ran front-page stories daily. Television news broadcasts led with updates on the investigation. Christy's photograph appeared everywhere, her smiling face a stark contrast to the horror of her death. The story resonated beyond Lancaster County, picked up by Philadelphia stations, then by national outlets. A young teacher, murdered in her own home, no suspects, no apparent motive. It had all the elements that capture public attention and refuse to let go. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people in those first weeks. They administered polygraph tests to anyone close to Christy. They collected fingerprints. They took DNA samples, though the technology to analyze them effectively was still limited. They followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. A tip line was established. Calls came in constantly, people reporting suspicious neighbors, ex-boyfriends, strangers they had seen in the area. Each tip was logged, investigated, and ultimately led nowhere. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the lack of evidence. Crime scenes usually tell a story. There are fingerprints, footprints, witness accounts, physical evidence that creates a trail. But Christy's apartment offered frustratingly little. The biological evidence collected at the scene was preserved carefully. But in 1991, DNA profiling was not yet sophisticated enough to create a usable profile from the samples. They had evidence, but they couldn't identify who it belonged to. The first inconsistencies emerged not from evidence, but from the absence of it. Why were there no signs of forced entry? Why was nothing stolen? Why was there no evidence of the killer having injured themselves during the struggle? Christy had fought. Her defensive wounds made that clear. But there was no blood found that wasn't hers, no skin under her fingernails, nothing that pointed to an identifiable attacker. Detectives developed theories. Perhaps Christy knew her killer, had let them involuntarily. Perhaps it was someone from her building, someone who had access to a master key. Perhaps it was a stranger who had been watching her, who knew her routine, who had found a way inside. Each theory was investigated thoroughly. Each led to dead ends. Timeline discrepancies were examined with microscopic attention. Christy had last been seen alive by her parents around 8 o'clock Sunday evening. The attack occurred sometime Monday morning between 6 and 8 o'clock. That gave the killer a window of approximately 10 hours to have entered the apartment, though the most likely scenario placed the attack early Monday morning, when Christy would have been preparing for work. Whoever did this knew her schedule, knew she lived alone, knew that early morning would offer the best opportunity. Physical evidence was cataloged and stored. Hair samples that didn't match Christy's. Fiber samples that didn't match her clothing or bedding. Biological evidence that would remain largely useless until DNA technology advanced enough to create a profile. Investigators knew they were sitting on potential answers, locked in evidence that they couldn't yet read. The investigation continued through December, through the holidays, into 1992. Detectives refused to give up, working the case even as other crimes demanded attention. But leads dried up, tips slowed to a trickle. The media moved on to other stories. Christy's murder remained unsolved, the file growing thicker but no closer to naming a suspect. By the summer of 1992, the investigation had effectively gone cold. The evidence was preserved. The case remained open. Detectives would occasionally revisit it, re-interview witnesses, look for something they might have missed. But there was nothing new to find. Whoever killed Christy Mirack had committed the perfect crime, or so it seemed. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, or questioned whether the person sleeping beside you could harbor terrible secrets, the years that followed Christy's death offered a cruel lesson in how thoroughly a killer could hide in plain sight. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, someone was living an ordinary life, going to work, interacting with neighbors, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while carrying the knowledge of what they had done. That person went asleep each night knowing they had taken Christy Mirack's life and gotten away with it. The psychological weight on investigators was immense. Detective work is about closure, about solving puzzles, about bringing justice to victims and peace to families. An unsolved murder sits differently. It haunts. It whispers questions in quiet moments. What did we miss? Who did we not look at carefully enough? Is the killer watching us, reading the newspaper coverage, feeling invincible? For Christy's family, the weight was unbearable. Her parents aged visibly in the months following her death. Her mother stopped going to church, unable to reconcile her faith with the senselessness of her daughter's murder. Her father became obsessed with the case, calling detectives weekly, demanding updates, unable to accept that there were no answers. Her siblings tried to move forward with their lives, but grief and rage followed them everywhere. The community of East Lampeter Township changed after Christy's death. People who had never locked their doors began installing deadbolts and security systems. Women who had lived alone sought roommates or moved back home with family. Parents became more protective of their children, more suspicious of strangers, more aware that terrible things could happen even in quiet, safe places. The innocence of the community had been shattered, replaced by a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Months became years. 1992 turned into 1993, then 1994, then 1995. The case file remained open, but it gathered dust in a cabinet at the Lancaster County District Attorney's office. Occasionally, a detective would pull it out, review the evidence, make a few calls. But there was nothing new to pursue. The biological evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology to catch up. Clear's throat in 1997, advances in DNA technology offered new hope. The FBI had developed more sophisticated methods for creating DNA profiles from biological evidence. Lancaster County investigators sent the evidence from Christy's case to the state police lab for analysis. Weeks later, the results came back. A DNA profile had been successfully created from biological evidence collected at the scene. It was a major breakthrough, the kind of development that could crack a cold case wide open. The profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and unsolved crime scenes. Investigators waited for a hit for the system to identify a match. Days passed, weeks passed, months passed. No match was found. The killer's DNA was not in the system. Either they had never been arrested and convicted of a crime requiring DNA submission, or they had somehow avoided detection entirely. The DNA profile gave investigators hope, but also frustration. They knew who the killer was, at least biologically. They had his genetic signature, but they couldn't attach a name to it. The profile sat in CODIS, waiting for the day when the killer would make a mistake, would be arrested for something else, would have their DNA entered into the system. That day might come tomorrow, or it might never come. Years continued to pass. The case was featured on local television specials marking anniversaries of Christy's death. On the 10th anniversary in 2001, Lancaster newspapers ran retrospective articles, interviewing detectives who had worked the case, speaking with Christy's family about their ongoing grief. Her parents aged further, their hope for justice fading with each passing year. They began to accept that they might never know who killed their daughter, might never see her killer brought to trial. In 2003, Christy's mother passed away from cancer. Those close to the family believed the stress and grief of the preceding 12 years had contributed to her illness. She died without answers, without justice, without the closure she had desperately sought. At her funeral, mourners whispered that she had died of a broken heart, that Christy's murder had killed her too, just more slowly. The investigation continued in fits and starts. In 2005, a new detective was assigned to review cold cases in Lancaster County. He spent weeks poring over Christy's file, re-interviewing witnesses who were still alive, looking for anything previous investigators might have missed. He found nothing new. The case remained frozen in time, the DNA profile sitting unused in CODIS, waiting for a match that never came. In 2008, another technological advance offered renewed hope. Familial DNA searching had become a viable investigative tool. If the killer's exact DNA profile wasn't in CODIS, perhaps a close relative's was. Law enforcement could search for partial matches, for profiles that shared significant genetic markers, indicating a family relationship. Several states, including Pennsylvania, began allowing familial DNA searches in certain circumstances. Lancaster County investigators requested a familial search of CODIS, looking for any profiles that might be related to the DNA profile from Christy's case. The search was conducted. Several partial matches were identified, but none led anywhere productive. Either the relatives identified had no connection to the case, or the genetic relationship was too distant to be useful. Another dead end. Another disappointment. For those who have noticed how technology changes what is possible, the late 2000s and early 2010s brought revolutionary advances in genetic genealogy. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com were creating massive databases of DNA profiles, submitted voluntarily by people interested in learning about their heritage and finding distant relatives. These databases were exponentially larger than CODIS, containing millions of profiles from people who had never committed crimes, never been arrested, never had any interaction with law enforcement. In 2018, investigators in California used genetic genealogy to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial murderer and rapist who had terrorized communities for decades before vanishing without a trace. The breakthrough sent shockwaves through law enforcement nationwide. Suddenly, unsolved cases that had seemed hopeless could be revisited using this new investigative tool. DNA profiles from crime scenes could be uploaded to genealogy databases, creating family trees that led investigators to suspects who had never been on their radar. Lancaster County investigators paid attention. In early 2018, they began exploring whether genetic genealogy could be used to identify Christy Mirack's killer. The DNA profile from the crime scene was submitted to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database that allowed law enforcement uploads. Within days, matches began appearing. Distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared genetic markers with the killer but had no idea their DNA had led investigators to their family tree. A genetic genealogist was brought in to analyze the results. She began constructing family trees, tracing the ancestry of the genetic matches backward through generations, looking for common ancestors. It was painstaking work, requiring access to birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data. Slowly, a picture emerged. The genetic matches pointed to a specific family line, originating in Pennsylvania, spreading across several counties over multiple generations. By summer 2018, the genealogist had narrowed the search to a handful of men who fit the profile. They were the right age, had lived in or near Lancaster County in 1991, and descended from the family line indicated by the genetic matches. One name stood out: Raymond Charles Rowe, known to friends as DJ Freeze, a popular disc jockey who performed at school dances, weddings, and community events throughout Lancaster County. Rowe was 49 years old in 2018. He lived in Penn Township, just a few miles from where Christy had been killed 27 years earlier. He was married with children. He had no criminal record. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary member of the community, well-liked and successful in his business. But investigators began digging deeper. Clear's throat. In 1991, Raymond Rowe had been 23 years old, working as a DJ and living in the Lancaster area. His business brought him into schools regularly, including some in the same district where Christy taught. Had their paths crossed? Had he seen her at a school event? Had he become fixated on her? Investigators needed a DNA sample from Rowe to confirm the match, but they had to be careful. They couldn't simply approach him and ask for a swab. If he was guilty, he might flee. If he was innocent, such an approach could devastate his life and reputation. They needed to obtain his DNA surreptitiously to confirm the match before moving forward. On June 24, 2018, investigators attended a water park where Rowe was performing as a DJ at a community event. They watched him from a distance, waiting for an opportunity. Rowe drank water from a bottle throughout the day. When the event ended, he threw the bottle into a trash can. Investigators retrieved it once Rowe had left. The bottle was carefully packaged and sent to the lab for DNA analysis. On June 25, 2018, exactly 27 years after Christy Mirack's murder, the lab results came back. The DNA on the water bottle matched the DNA profile from the crime scene. Raymond Charles Rowe was Christy's killer. The arrest was planned carefully. On June 25, 2018, a team of investigators approached Rowe at his home. He answered the door wearing casual clothes, looking confused when he saw the officers. They identified themselves and asked if he would come with them to answer some questions. Rowe agreed, still seemingly bewildered. At the police station, detectives read Rowe his rights. They told him they were investigating a cold case from 1991. They asked where he had been living in November 1991. Rowe said he had been in Lancaster County, working as a DJ. They asked if he remembered Christy Mirack. Rowe paused, his expression changing. He said he didn't know that name. Detectives told him they had evidence connecting him to Christy's murder. They told him about the DNA match. Rowe's face went pale. He asked for a lawyer. The interview ended. Rowe was arrested and charged with criminal homicide, rape, and related offenses. News of the arrest spread rapidly. By evening, it was the lead story on every local news broadcast. Raymond Rowe, known throughout Lancaster County as DJ Freeze, beloved entertainer at countless school events and community gatherings, was accused of murdering a young teacher 27 years earlier. The community was stunned. Those who knew Rowe expressed disbelief. His wife told reporters there had to be a mistake. His children maintained their father's innocence. Friends said Rowe was a gentle person, incapable of violence, that the arrest must be based on bad evidence or a misunderstanding. But others began sharing stories of feeling uncomfortable around Rowe, of inappropriate comments he had made, of behavior that seemed off but was dismissed at the time. Parents whose children attended schools where Rowe had performed expressed horror at the possibility that a killer had been entertaining their kids. School districts scrambled to review their records, to determine how often Rowe had been in their buildings, to reassure parents that students had never been in danger. But the reassurances felt hollow. How could anyone have known? How could they have prevented someone with no criminal record, no history of violence from doing his job? The case moved forward through the court system. Rowe pleaded not guilty at his arraignment, maintaining his innocence despite the DNA evidence. His defense attorneys argued that while DNA placed Rowe at the scene, It didn't prove he was responsible for Christy's death. Perhaps he had been in her apartment at some other time for some innocent reason. Perhaps the DNA had been transferred from another location. The arguments were weak, and everyone knew it. Behind the scenes, however, Rowe's resolve began to crumble. His attorneys laid out the evidence against him. The DNA match was ironclad. Genetic genealogy had created an unbreakable chain connecting him to the crime. If the case went to trial, he would be convicted. The death penalty was a possibility, though Pennsylvania had not executed anyone in decades. On October 22, 2018, 4 months after his arrest, Raymond Rowe changed his plea. In a Lancaster County courtroom, before a judge, prosecutors, and Christy's family members, Rowe pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He admitted to killing Christy Mirack on November 25, 1991. He did not provide details about why he had done it, about how he had gained entry to her apartment, about what had driven him to such violence. Christy's father, now elderly and frail, sat in the courtroom and watched Rowe plead guilty. He did not speak during the hearing, but tears streamed down his face. Justice had finally come, 27 years too late for his wife to see it, but it had come nonetheless. The man who killed his daughter would spend the rest of his life in prison. On November 19, 2018, Rowe appeared in court for sentencing. The judge addressed him directly, noting the brutality of the crime, the decades of pain inflicted on Christy's family, the years Rowe had spent living freely while his victim lay in a grave. The sentence was mandatory for first-degree murder in Pennsylvania, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rowe was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look at Christy's family members as he passed them. His wife and children were not present. His business had been shuttered. His reputation was destroyed. Everything he had built over 27 years had collapsed in a matter of months, brought down by science he likely never imagined would exist. Media coverage of the resolution was extensive. The case became a touchstone for discussions about genetic genealogy as an investigative tool, about cold cases being solved through new technology, about the importance of never giving up on seeking justice for victims. Christy's story was featured on national television programs, in true crime podcasts, in articles examining how law enforcement had finally caught her killer. The investigation's conclusion brought a measure of peace to Christy's surviving family members. Her father, now in his 80s, told reporters that he could finally rest, knowing his daughter's killer was behind bars. He thanked the investigators who had never given up, who had kept working the case even when it seemed hopeless. He thanked the genetic genealogist whose work had created the breakthrough. He wished his wife had lived to see this day. For the Lancaster County community, Rowe's arrest and conviction brought a mix of relief and revulsion. Relief that a killer had finally been caught, that the mystery had been solved, that families could feel a bit safer knowing that particular monster was locked away. But revulsion at the realization that for 27 years, a murderer had lived among them, had entertained their children, had been welcomed into their schools and homes, all while carrying the secret of what he had done. Clear's Throat schools where Rowe had performed scrambled to process the revelation. Parents demanded answers about how thoroughly vendors were vetted, about what safeguards existed to protect children. But the truth was uncomfortable. Rowe had no criminal record. Nothing in his background would have raised red flags. The only way to have caught him would have been through DNA evidence connected to Christy's murder. And that technology hadn't existed in 1991, wasn't sophisticated enough to identify him until 2018. The case raised broader questions about how many other killers might be living ordinary lives, their crimes decades old, their identities hidden by time, and the limitations of old investigative techniques. How many cold cases could be solved using genetic genealogy? How many families were still waiting for answers that might finally be within reach? In the years since Rowe's conviction, Lancaster County investigators have continued using genetic genealogy to investigate other cold cases. Several have been solved. DNA profiles that sat unused for decades are now producing leads, identifying suspects, bringing long-delayed justice to victims and their families. The technology that caught Christy's killer has become a standard tool in law enforcement's arsenal. But genetic genealogy has also sparked debate about privacy, about the ethics of using genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes, about whether people who submit their DNA to learn about their ancestry understand that their genetic information might be used to catch a relative who committed a crime. These debates continue, with advocates on both sides making compelling arguments. For Christy Mirack, these debates came too late. She was 25 years old when she died, her life barely begun, her potential unfulfilled. She never married, never had children, never grew old. Her students from that final year are now adults in their 40s, many with children of their own. But some still remember the kind teacher with the bright smile, who never came back after that November Monday. Rowerstown Elementary School maintains a memorial garden in Christy's honor, a quiet space with a bench and flowering trees where students can sit and reflect. Her name is inscribed on a plaque that reads simply, Christy Mirack, beloved teacher, 1966 to 1991. Teachers at the school make sure new students learn about Christy, about the importance of kindness and dedication, about the loss the community suffered. Christy's father passed away in 2021, 3 years after seeing his daughter's killer brought to justice. He was buried beside his wife, and not far from Christy. In his obituary, the family requested that instead of flowers, donations be made to a scholarship fund, established in Christy's name for students pursuing careers in education. The scholarship ensures that her legacy continues, that her commitment to teaching lives on through young people entering the profession she loved. Raymond Rowe remains incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Phoenix, a maximum security prison in Pennsylvania. He is now 55 years old. He will die in prison, his life measured in decades behind bars, time that stretches ahead with no possibility of freedom. He has given no interviews, made no public statements about why he killed Christy or what drove him to commit such violence. Perhaps he has no answers. Perhaps the reasons are buried so deeply within his psyche that even he doesn't fully understand them. The broader legacy of the case extends beyond one solved murder. It represents a shift in how law enforcement approaches cold cases, how science and technology can finally provide answers that seemed forever out of reach. It offers hope to thousands of families still waiting to learn what happened to their loved ones, still seeking justice that has been delayed for years or decades. For those who have ever doubted whether persistence matters, whether continuing to fight for justice serves any purpose, Christy's case provides a definitive answer. 27 years passed between her murder and her killer's arrest. 27 years during which investigators refused to close the case, refused to stop looking for answers, refused to let Christy be forgotten. That persistence, combined with technological advances that no one could have predicted in 1991, finally brought Raymond Rowe to justice. The case also serves as a reminder that killers are not always the strangers we imagine lurking in shadows. Sometimes they are the familiar faces we see at community events, the people we trust to entertain our children, the neighbors we wave to in passing. Evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind a smile and a successful business and the appearance of normalcy. Christy Mirack would have been 59 years old today had she lived. She might have retired from teaching, or might still be in a classroom, still inspiring students, still making a difference. She might have married, had children and grandchildren, built a life full of love and meaning. Instead, her life ended on a November morning in 1991, stolen by a man who then went on living as if nothing had happened. But Christy is not forgotten. Her story matters. Her life mattered. And the justice finally delivered in 2018, though terribly delayed, sends a message to killers who believe they have gotten away with their crimes. Technology advances. Databases grow. Methods improve. Cold cases are solved. The past does not stay buried forever. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.